It's time for a bit of drop pod assault. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're always looking to get the best out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Since the recent Space Marine Codex came out, we've been looking through the updated datasheets and how they might be used as part of your Space Marine army, and today we're turning our lens on the drop pod, one of the most iconic transport vehicles of the Space Marines, that's gained a new lease of life with the new rules. Now it can arrive first turn. In this review we'll have a look at its datasheet and any positives and drawbacks, any obvious combos with what sort of contents we can put in it for various different chapters, and what sort of loadouts I would consider running in a game of 40k myself. As I was saying, the drop pod is an absolutely iconic element of Space Marine armies. There's nothing like being fired from your battle barge in low orbit down through the atmosphere to slam into the ground and deploy a heavily armed shock squad to wipe out the enemy. The drop pod kit gives you that feeling as well, being able to spring open the doors to let your Space Marines out, though it is one of the most famously hard to build kits that Games Workshop have ever released. So how do these things work in 40k? Let's take a look at their datasheet. So a drop pod is a dedicated transport choice for Codex Space Marines, and will cost you 65 points if you arm it with a Stormbolter. It's immobile with a movement of 0, no weapon skill and attacks meaning it can't fight in close combat, ballistic skill of 3 up, strength and toughness of 6, 8 wounds, leadership 8, and a 3 up save. Basically you deploy this via the drop pod assault special rule, where during deployment you'll typically set it up in reserve, with a unit of up to 10 Space Marine infantry models embarked inside it. It can't carry Primaris, Terminators, jump pack troops or Centurions. From there you can come onto the battlefield at the end of the movement phase as per normal reserves. You put down the drop pod, and then any infantry models embarked within it must immediately disembark. They can't stay inside it, and they can't get back in for any reason. This also has the addendum that for matched play, this model and any units embarked in it are exempt from the tactical restraint match play rule, which is the one that prevents you from bringing in units turn 1. Though they did FAQ it that you still can't bring it in turn 4 or later. It has to be brought in on either turns 1, 2 or 3. This is really quite a powerful ability as it's good for delivering initial alpha strikes. You can get your assaulty or shooty Space Marine squad right to the front line right on turn 1 if you're willing to pay the premium of buying this drop pod for them. It's interesting that you do have the option of setting this up on the battlefield turn 1 should you want to. I think there are very rarely any situations in which you actually would want to do that, but potentially to secure an objective or block movement could be a couple of options for wanting to set up your drop pod on the board if you've decided that you definitely don't need it for transporting whichever elite unit that you were going to transport in it originally. So that is actually an option, even if it's not usually going to be a very good option. There was also an FAQ addressing the drop pod doors. They decided that when the drop pod is deployed you can either keep the doors furled up or spring them down, and if you do spring them down then these are treated as part of the model's hull, so you can't deploy other models on top of them, and for enemy models having to keep greater than 1 inches outside of the drop pod in terms of close combat and moving, it means that the drop pod will take up a far bigger space on the board. So when you're putting down your drop pod, you should probably think whether or not you want it to be a big move blocker for the enemy, or whether it might be better for it to be just one solid object, which might be better for blocking line of sight, and it might give your own Marines more room to deploy if there's not much space. The drop pods do have the option for trading out their Stormbolter for a Deathwind missile launcher, but unfortunately the Deathwind missile launcher isn't the most overwhelming in terms of damage output these days. It's basically a 12-inch Assault D6, Strength 5, AP nothing, Damage 1 weapon, and it costs 5 points where the Stormbolter just costs 2. So on average the Stormbolter is going to get more shots within 12-inch range, and those shots will be at Strength 4 rather than Strength 5. And of course the Stormbolter has the option of firing 2 shots at long range, which the Deathwind launcher doesn't. I'd say that the Deathwind launcher is a bit of a side grade rather than an upgrade. It's only really going to be any better when you're shooting at Toughness 4, Toughness 5 or Toughness 8 models, and it's always going to be worse when you would most want to shoot at units that are greater than 12 inches away. So my advice is just to take the Stormbolter, though it's really not the biggest deal either way. Drop pods have the Angels of Death special rule, meaning that you'll be getting extra AP on that Stormbolter or Deathwind launcher if you're in the tactical doctrine, though I'd certainly never think about altering my battle plan to bring them down turn 2, as that extra AP isn't really a big deal on quite small guns. One other thing to note about the drop pod's reserve rules is that the drop pod itself is deployed from reserves, but the unit inside is technically getting out of a transport, not being deployed straight out of reserve. This is quite an important distinction because it means that any enemy stratagems or intercept type abilities, such as Auspex scan, Tau early warning overrides, and Eldar have an intercept stratagem based around their Farseer that I forget the name of. I believe that all of these will have to target the drop pod and they can't actually target the unit that's getting out of it, which is quite a big deal, and it does keep potentially some fragile units safe, so they can do what they need to do later in the turn. So it does make drop pods a little bit more resilient in these circumstances compared with just deep striking the units by some other means. Finally, one big weakness of the drop pod is that sometimes it can be a bit of a gift to your opponent if they're going to play some close combat related games with it. Basically, if you do drop down a drop pod on the other side of the battlefield near your opponent's army, it's an immobile vehicle, it can never fall back from close combat. If they do deal with whatever the contents that your drop pod just disgorged, and if they charge the drop pod with a unit that won't kill it, then that unit will be safe from your shooting in the next turn, as you can't shoot units that are in close combat. This could be particularly horrible with some sort of flying shooting unit. Say if your opponent has 2 repulse executioners, the tanks could repeatedly shoot, charge the drop pod so they can't be shot, then fall back and shoot again, and then rinse and repeat if the drop pod's still alive and they aren't dead. Also, if you drop your drop pod near an objective, if a enemy light troops choice charges the drop pod, then they might well just have secured that objective for the entire game. As you won't be able to shoot them, they almost certainly won't kill the drop pod, and of course they have Auspex to take that objective away from the drop pod. So if you are dropping a drop pod down near where the enemy is, it is quite important to have a countercharge unit around if you don't want your opponent playing these tricks, so they can't just happily charge your drop pod for no consequence. All that being said, the drop pod is a really good delivery method for certain units that either can't deep strike or units that want to come in turn 1. So let's have a talk about some of the various contents that we can put in the drop pod. So my top pick for drop pod units are these ones. There may well be others that you're particularly keen on, but I think that these guys are some of the most outstanding options. Firstly, Vanguard Veterans, if they don't have jump packs, can be put in a drop pod and potentially get a turn 1 charge. You're really paying for the turn 1 assault possibility here, as they can take jump packs, and if you have a full squad with jump packs, it will cost less than buying them a drop pod. But having angry Space Marines with chainswords or all manner of power weapons in your opponent's front line right from turn 1 is a big advantage and could well be worth a drop pod for. Secondly, we have Devastators, particularly Grav Devastators, though maybe you could try a multi-melter variant in Salamanders. I made an entire video about the tried and tested combo of 4 Grav Cannons Devastator squads coming out of drop pods and how devastating they can be. What you do is you take an Armorium Cherub so one can shoot twice, use the Signum so one's hitting on a 2, and pop the Gravitic Amplification stratagem to allow you to reroll all wounds with those Grav Cannons and all damage rolls. It is a pricey combo, clocking in at 215 points I believe, but it almost guarantees any single tank dying in one massive punch of Grav fire. Next we have Stern Guard, and you can fill these in a few different ways. You could take them with lots of Storm Bolters, take them with their standard special issue bolt guns, or load up with a bunch of combi weapons, and use the drop pod to get close so all of this firepower can be deployed to optimal effect. Company Veterans, another solid choice, particularly the variety with Storm Bolters and Storm Shields. You could take 2 squads of Company Veterans in a drop pod and still have some room to spare for a character if needed. Talking of fighty characters, they're also another solid option, particularly any character that isn't a Terminator or jump pack, but has impressive close combat stats, always good at buffing close range units. Special characters can often be good for this, things like Vulcan Hestan of the Salamanders, or Pedro Cantor, or potentially just delivering a cheaper Smash Captain that doesn't want to pay for a jump pack, alongside a big unit of veterans. Tactical squads can also be an option to drop via a drop pod. As a general rule of thumb, I wouldn't tend to use tactical squads to fill out drop pods as part of a core strategy. Drop pods are quite expensive and it's worth buying a better unit to deliver, to get the most value out of your big investment in the pod. That being said, I could see some areas where it could work. Say you were just taking some troops as tax units to fill a battalion. You could take a couple of those as small tactical squads with a combi melter and a melter gun, put them in a drop pod and drop them right close to the enemy. This could be particularly powerful as Salamanders, as they have benefits both to melter weaponry and those rerolls can make those melter weapons really likely to hit and wound. So if you're looking to get a bit more value out of your cheap troop choices, then buying a drop pod for delivery alongside your heavy hitters could be a reasonable option. Finally, there are some chapter unique units such as Blood Angels Death Company or Space Wolves Wolf Guard that could utilise drop pods to good effect. Anything that's monstrously fighty and also doesn't have a jump pack or Terminator armour will obviously profit a whole load by getting closer to the enemy. Being able to get a otherwise slow moving squad to have a first turn charge is a real asset. Let's look at a few chapters now for who is best at putting which of these options in the pods. The Grav Devastators are particularly stand out as either Iron Hands or Imperial Fists. Iron Hands get to move and shoot and reroll 1s, so you'll be hitting on 3s rerolling 1s even though you moved. And they also have the stratagem that allows them to get extra wounds on 6s if they all fire at the same target, so they can pack an absolutely devastating punch. Imperial Fists are great for the Grav Devastator combination, because they get +1 damage against vehicles, which is absolutely phenomenal on Grav cannons and amounts to around about a 50% buff in firepower. Ignoring cover isn't bad either. Ultramarines are also a solid option due to their moving and shooting for no penalty ability, as are Salamanders, both for the rerolls and for the stratagem Crucible of Battle to give them +1 to wound, which Grav devs really like. In terms of Vanguard Vets or other assault units, particularly things like Black Templars, White Scars and Blood Angels are absolutely going to love these guys. Black Templars are great because they get to reroll their charge innately, which is brilliant both for fighty characters and for units of veterans alike. White Scars have access to boosted charges with stratagems and relics, and of course their assault doctrine is great, meaning that you could keep a unit in reserve till turn 3 to use that +1 damage in the assault doctrine. Blood Angels have many ways of inflicting chainsword and power weapon related death on their opponents, but Vanguard Veterans, Death Company on foot, and certain special characters such as Brother Corbulo or Gabriel Seth have very good synergy with drop pods, and again ramming power armoured death machines down your opponent's throat turn 1 is a good way to turn up the pressure a bit. In terms of the Stern Guard and shooting veterans, Salamander's successor Stern Guard with combi flamers is a really solid option. If you make them as Salamander successors, then you can take the +3-inch range chapter tactic, which means that you can deep strike out of the drop pod and still barbecue everyone with your flamethrowers. They have stratagems to make sure that you get the maximum amount of shots with your flamer weapons. Vulcan Hestan can boost those flamer weapons, and they have even more stratagems that you can unload if you really want to make them hit as hard as they can. I made a list that was centered around these guys in drop pods, so have a look at my Salamander's successor Firestorm Brigade if you'd like to see that, but they are absolutely brutal punches. Ultramarines are always a solid pick with bolt weapons, particularly as they'll be able to move and fire as if stationary, to mean that you can activate bolter discipline up to 24-inch range for any bolter armed dudes getting it out of a drop pod. Imperial Fists also synergize very well with bolt guns such as the Stern Guard, and I'd also like to mention Dark Angel's Plasma Veterans as a potentially good shout. You could arm a squad of 10 of them with combi plasma and unleash weapons of the Dark Age to mean that you're hitting with damage 3 on every single shot. I think that these guys could compete decently with Plasma Inceptors for the best plasma death machine. One chapter in particular that they're a little bit less useful with is the Raven Guard. Raven Guard can put any infiltrating unit in Deep Strike Reserve for 1 command point, which is usually going to be superior to buying a drop pod for 65 points. The only reason I'd use a drop pod as Raven Guard is if you want that actual first turn punch, which isn't the worst option ever to be fair, as Raven Guard do alpha strikes quite well. But I'd certainly think twice about actually buying a drop pod compared with just spending a command point to achieve much the same effect. Finally, Death Watch Veterans are an interesting option. Again, they have the option to put their squads in teleport reserve, but having a drop pod to drop down 40 special issue ammunition shots first turn to clear out all of the enemy's screening units is a really solid option and not a threat to be underestimated. I wouldn't do this with multiple units I don't think, but just having one to get to grips with the enemy turn 1 could be pretty handy while you wait for the rest of the Death Watch to come in deep strike on turn 2 or turn 3. Armour of Contempt is an option to shrug some mortal wounds, but in general there's not really much value in keeping your drop pod alive in the first place, and sometimes it might even be better if it dies, rather than becomes a big charge magnet for your opponent. In game you've got some interesting options. The turn 1 Alpha Strike is great, but you can also use its stature or its large base to either block movement or block line of sight to certain units. The main tactical decision that you're going to be is what turn to bring it on with, and where should you deploy it on that turn. In general, the rule of thumb is that the earlier that you could destroy enemy units, the better, as that will mean that they have less chance to have impact on the game. But with deep striking units, you might often have enemy screaming units that you want to eliminate before you let the contents of your drop pod get to the really good stuff in the centre of the army. If you are delaying for this reason though, then you do need to make sure you can actually kill the screen, because there's nothing worse than waiting till the next turn and then still being screened out because you couldn't get rid of all of these screening units, or your opponent's made some clever moves, meaning that you're still zoned out a long way from his heavy hitters. So that's my review of the drop pod. I'm glad that it's managed to go from being an absolute waste of points, as it was for much of 8th edition, to now something that's quite balanced, where it's an expensive option that you get for premier transport to the enemy lines, without being so ubiquitous that people can just spam entire armies of them and clog up the entire board with drop pods, as was the case for much of 7th. I don't miss 7th edition. I am glad to see that they're viable again, however. They can certainly add an interesting extra threat that your opponent has to deal with, and it gives you another tool in the box to counter your opponent's moves. Let me know if you have any particular combinations with drop pods that I've missed. I'd certainly like to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. If you'd like to see more of my videos, please feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or to support me on Patreon, as making all of these videos does take quite a long time. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys in the next video.